This is the I Was a Wheelchair Kid podcast. It's true stories of people who grew up using wheelchairs after being paralyzed and how they figured out their lives. I'm your host, Pete Anziano, and I've been using a wheelchair myself for almost 20 years. Although I wasn't injured as a child, I've spent those 20 years in a job where I help people of all ages adjust to living with paralysis. And I have learned that being injured as a kid brings a whole different set of problems. These podcasts are the personal stories about how kids went about finding their own solutions as children. They're adults now, but their childhood memories are powerful. In this episode, Bill tells his story. He was paralyzed at the age of only 8 months. So, he's lived his entire life using a wheelchair. His story is titled, The Bully Who Changed My Life. Here's how the story begins.
When I was 8 months old, I was diagnosed with neuroblastoma of the spine, which is a rare form of cancer. I had the tumor removed at a hospital, but as a result of the tumor, I was left an incomplete paraplegic. And primarily, I've lived my entire life using a wheelchair. Growing up, my house was not wheelchair accessible. We lived in a tri-level house. There were stairs everywhere. My bedroom was on the second floor. So if my parents didn't carry me up to my bedroom, I crawled up the stairs, crawled down the stairs, wanted to go play with the kids in the basement or play kids, we called it the rec room. There was 4 stairs to get down to the rec room. But primarily I crawled. That's how I got around, is I just crawled on my hands all the time. I was always kind of told to settle down, you're going to get hurt. One of the problems that I really had growing up was I had a lot of brittle bones and I had a lot of leg fractures. I had, I believe, 12 fractures on my right leg and maybe 5 or 6 on my left. I spent a lot of time in cast, but I was always a resourceful little kid and always wanting to get into trouble. I always looked for adventure. There was not a lot of accessible equipment. And I remember the first wheelchair that I got was probably 2 sizes too big. It was red. It was like a tank. It was very hard to maneuver.
So, Bill came up with his own way to create a much speedier vehicle.
So back in my day, all the kids had big wheels. It was all made out of plastic. It was red and yellow. And I wanted to ride the big wheels too. I was always told, no, you can't. So what I did was took the seat off of the big wheel. I would put my knees where the seat would, and I would lean over the handlebars and put my chest in the middle of the handlebars and lean over and grab the pedals. And I would pedal with my hands. And I would fly around the neighborhood, trying to keep up with all the kids. And some of them I would even beat. But then as I got a little bit bigger, you could no longer use the big wheel because your toes would drag on the ground and you would slow you down or you would wear out your shoes.
Bill's parents got him an adaptive toy car, and that was fun for a while.
There was one adaptive car that my parents got me. They called it a crazy car, and it was a 6-wheel car, and it had hand things on the side that you would turn, and that would get you going. But again, once I started getting a little bit bigger and I outgrew that thing and the legs got too long, it was a lot harder to drive that crazy car.
Bill started at a special school for kids with disabilities, but that didn't last for long.
My mom, she really was my rock and taught me the first thing about advocacy, because when I was young, I was enrolled in special education and I had to go to school with all children with disabilities. You were grouped in with everybody. So you went to grade school with all kids with all types of disabilities, whether they had a developmental disability, visual impairment, physical disabilities, you were all grouped together. And that was one of the things my mom fought against. She fought really hard to get me mainstreamed in the public school system. She says, there's nothing wrong with his brain, it's with his legs. I want him involved in the school, and he's going to school.
His mother prevailed. Bill was mainstreamed, which meant he was put into a regular public school system, not a special school.
So I remember I was mainstreamed in the public school system from the 2nd grade on. And I was the only kid in my grade school class with a disability. So I did stand out because I had a disability. I was different from everybody else. The desk that I used was an old wooden desk that they brought in to make me use because you could take the chair away. So being mainstreamed from grade school on is another thing that really helped me become the person that I am today.
Bill was the only kid with a disability in his entire class. He stood out, which made him a target for hurtful attention. Today, we call it bullying.
I had my share of bullying, being the only kid with a disability. So I learned firsthand the need to stick up for myself. But there was always a student who picked on everybody, so I was no different. But whenever he would see me in the hallway, he would walk up behind my wheelchair, and I had handlebars on my chair, and then he would go ahead and step on the back bar, pop a wheelie, and then drop me. And I'd fall, and then he'd take off and run. Or he would play around with you like, oh, I'm going to drop you, Billy, or I'm going to drop you. And then he'd let go and catch you, or then he would end up eventually dropping me, and I'd fall out of my wheelchair and have to get back in it. You know, I look back at it, and he's probably, he would do it almost, sometimes 2-3 times a day. In the morning when you got there, you go out for recess, he would do it at recess, or they would go ahead and do it on your way home from school. I would tell the teachers, and they would tell them not to do it. I'd go home and cry to my parents. My dad would always tell me, toughen up, Bill.
Bill was caught in an ugly situation until another kid came along with an idea.
Eventually, I met another kid that was getting bullied. And he says, Billy, we got to take care of this. We got to stop this. Kind of made friends in a way because I was with that group of kids that did get picked on. So I was going to be like their secret weapon. The idea was to get back at the kid that was bullying me, was we were going to teach him a lesson not to pick on somebody in a wheelchair. And when we got out of class at recess, my buddy was going to be behind me in the wheelchair, and he was going to run behind my wheelchair and push me as fast as he can, and then he was going to let go. And then he goes, just run into him and just knock him over. And I was worried that the kid was going to beat me up because I ran into him. And my friend looked at me and he says, Bill, he says, you're thinking at this all wrong. He says, you got to look at it. If you turn around and we teach him a lesson, he's never going to pick on you again because he got knocked over, got beat up by a kid in a wheelchair. He'll be the laughing stock of the school. And then if he turns around and beats you up, he'll be dead after recess because all the kids will pick on him for beating up somebody in a wheelchair. So it's a win-win situation. And that's basically what ended up happening. I learned firsthand about the importance of sticking up for yourself. And after that, honestly, I never got picked on again. You got kind of a little bit respected. After that incident, I knew I was going to be okay. I developed friends there. And, having friends, I never felt isolated. I look back at it, and 4th grade was my pivotal moment.
When kids are young, one important experience can change their whole outlook. And that's what happened to Bill. He went from victim to hero. Facing down the bully made him feel stronger, more accepted, and helped him make friends. Most of all, he felt a lot better about himself. So he continued to find new ways to adapt to the school environment. In sports, for instance.
They didn't have adaptive sports when I grew up, so the gym teacher convinced the school to invest in a weight system. And he bought a bench and dumbbells and weights. And while the kids went and did their activities for gym class, I went to the side and I would work out. And I would bench press, I would work with dumbbells and do free weights, and that was my job. If the kids were playing sports, my job was to be the official scorekeeper. But if the kids weren't doing something where I needed to keep score, I would go and work out for that 45-minute gym class. And I think that also helped me get strong and, get turned on to weightlifting, or at least, working out to keep the muscles in shape and keep my upper body very, very strong.
Even so, Bill was often still isolated at school. In those days, laws that required accommodations for people with disabilities were still years away.
I remember we used to eat our school lunches at our desks, but then when you got in the 5th, 6th grade, you went to the cafeteria to eat. And when the cafeteria wasn't accessible, they didn't have a wheelchair lift in there. So I sat at my desk eating my lunch with the school teacher. So I did have, my share of isolation growing up. When I got into junior high, they put in the wheelchair lifts so I can get down to the cafeteria. And I can get down to the gym. I can get down for assemblies. In junior high, that's where I started to learn the schools were forced to make the schools accessible. High school was a huge change for me, big change. I went to a big high school. I think my class was over 600. And again, it was adjustments. I honestly would say, again, I kind of stood out that I was the only kid with a disability. I was the only wheelchair user.
But by this time, Bill had learned how to make people comfortable around him and how to make new friends.
I was always outgoing. I was never a shy person. So I think establishing friendships, it was the key to my success. So instead of society molding to me in a way, I had to mold to society. I had to be the one to adjust. When we were in high school, if we'd go out with friends, we'd all pile in the car, the wheelchair would go in the trunk, and we'd go places, go to different parties. And if I couldn't get somewhere, I had my friends to help me figure out a way to get there. And we would do things together. I was called Airborne Bill because I would fly in my wheelchair and I would do all sorts of crazy little things, riding wheelies, all of that kind of stuff. And as I got older in high school, the girls always had a spot to sit because I'd have them sit on my lap and I'd wheel them from class to class, or what have you. I graduated high school in 1987. I went to community college for 2 years and got my associate's degree. There was the push for the Americans with Disabilities Act. That was my first go around with disability rights and disability advocacy. That's when I got involved with disability rights movement. I think I learned self-respect and self-esteem the hard way. As an individual with a disability, before others can accept you as a person with a disability, you have to accept your own disability. You have to come to some terms with it.
As it turned out, fighting for disability rights became his career. He was the first director of his town's Disability Services Office, where he pioneered a home modification program. Today, his job title is the Disability Liaison to the Illinois Secretary of State, where he's an active promoter of disability services. He's involved in adaptive sports. He's a tough sled hockey competitor and a lifelong scuba diver. He is married and has 3 children. And he still believes that discovering he could face down that bully was an important turning point in his life. This episode was produced by Thea Flom, Stephanie Lolino, and Ann Hambleton. Directed and edited by Dan Lombardi. Music by Cayman Kloss. And I'm your host, Pete Anziano. I Was a Wheelchair Kid is a joint project of FacingDisability.com and the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. It's funded in part by a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Grant directors are Dr. Alan Heineman and Dr. David Chen. You can find more I Was a Wheelchair Kid stories on FacingDisability.com/podcasts and on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.